We have a very busy day planned, so I'd like to make sure we start right on time. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jody Fissler, Senior Associate for Assessment Policy and Analysis at Chev. Thank you so much for being here, and you've already heard from me if you saw the introductory video. If you haven't, you can watch it later, I suppose, but in any case, welcome, and I'm happy to introduce President John Alger from JMU, our host for the day. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody. Great to see you all here, and I think we have some folks joining us virtually as well, so welcome to all of you. Great to have you here on the campus of James Madison University. And I know we've got a lot of special guests here today, the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia. Let's see, is Peter Blake here? I don't know, I haven't seen Peter yet, but he's the director of Chev. We have two Chev board members, Chev Board Chair Marge Connolly. Marge, would you give a wave? You'll hear from Marge in a moment, so thank you for being here. And also Alvin Scheck-Snyder. Alvin, would you give a wave? Thank you for your leadership at the state level. And welcome to all of you from our fellow institutions across the Commonwealth and from beyond. We have some folks from national organizations as well that are with us, as you'll hear from today. So I do want to thank Jody Fissler to start. Jody, thank you so much for all you have done. She has been an incredible organizer. I can tell you she's done a lot of work behind the scenes to get ready for today, and certainly with support from folks at Chev and from the team here at JMU. Mike Davis, the Chief of Staff here, our JMU team involved in all sorts of ways with video support, our Aramark team, which will be feeding us later today, so we are really appreciative. It takes a team effort to put on an event like this, as you all know. But it's a critical moment for us to focus on this topic, and I really commend Chev for its leadership in drawing attention to these issues. My own background, some of you may know I'm a recovering lawyer, as my friends like to say, with a background in constitutional law. And we're here at the institution, of course, named for the father of the U.S. Constitution, James Madison. So I'm especially pleased to host an event focused on these issues of civic engagement and civic education. And the stakes are incredibly high at this moment, as I think we're all now starting to realize. We know that democracy cannot be taken for granted here or elsewhere around the world. The threats are very real, both from within and from without. And in a hyper-polarized society, our students are faced with a barrage of divisive messages that are always trying to force them to choose sides instead of encouraging them to find ways to engage across differences. Just last week, I was at a major international conference in Doha, Qatar. Anybody been there by any chance? Amazing place. And there were speakers from around the world talking about the incredible urgency of bringing people together from diverse perspectives and different backgrounds and faith traditions to live in peace, and that really does require intentional effort and intentional leadership from education, and especially higher education, to produce those engaged citizens for a civil society. So I do believe very strongly, and I know all of you do too, which is why you're here, that higher education has a really critical role to play when it comes to producing those future generations of leaders and engaged citizens of all different disciplinary backgrounds. The founders themselves recognized this connection to higher education to sustain democracy, and some of them even talked about creating a national university, which never quite happened for that purpose, but they knew that there was that direct linkage. So, today, where are we? We know that the mission of higher education, so often people talk about it as a private good, right? Preparing students for high-paying jobs. And of course, that's really important. We want them all to be gainfully employed, but that's not a sufficient or complete description of our purpose. There is also a very strong public good aspect of our mission of producing engaged citizens who focus not just on their rights, but on their responsibilities in a democratic society. That doesn't have to be an either-or choice, it's a both and, right? Because the skill sets that students need to be engaged citizens are largely the same skills that they need to succeed in life and in their careers. You think about things like critical thinking, communications, ethical reasoning, teamwork, and leadership, and problem solving. Those are the same skills you need to be a good, engaged citizen and also to have a successful career. And these are skills and habits and dispositions that can be taught and learned. Finally, I think it's really important for us in Virginia to take a leadership role at this historic moment on these very issues. Think about our special place in United States and world history when it comes to these issues of democracy and civic engagement. Now, luckily, we've already started to embrace that role. Chev, of course, has identified civic engagement as a core competency, and our institutions have been working together to find ways to further this important work. At JMU, for example, we have our Center for Civic Engagement, which helps to lead these efforts, and I know that many campuses have similar centers and leaders that are doing this work. As Americans, we talk about the Constitution a lot. It's rather ironic because I think a lot of people talk about it without ever having read it, right? But as part of our commitment, I can tell you, hot off the press here at JMU, you have to have large pockets, but this is a new pocket Constitution. You'll see it's in purple. You may notice a theme here at JMU with my shirt. What happens when you combine blue and red, by the way? What do you get, right? But our students in Gen Ed will be getting this this fall as they study constitutional issues, American government and justice, and other issues. And hopefully they will actually read it and pay attention to it. And this is something that we feel very strongly about, is that kind of civic education. And we also have a national leadership role to play here in Virginia. A lot of us, I can tell you, the presidents and others are involved on a nonpartisan basis in organizations like Campus Compact, the Partnership for American Democracy. We have some of our national higher ed associations here that are also involved in these issues and efforts. So there really is an opportunity at this moment for us to step forward together. But we can't do it alone or in silos. There are so many great people, so many great efforts that are happening on our campuses, but we don't often talk to each other about how we can work together across institutional lines. And I hope that's what today will help us to figure out how to do here in Virginia and beyond. So if we can think about coordination, communication, sharing best practices, continuing to convene, there is real power in being together to talk about these issues. I think that's how we can make real progress. And I can assure you that the Virginia Council of Presidents is ready and willing to work with all of you on these issues. So as we go forward today, I hope we can be guided by the words that begin this document. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, right? We're not perfect. We know that there's important work to be done, and that's what we're going to do together, certainly starting today, here and now. Thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate your commitment. And now you will hear from Marge Connolly, the board chair of Chev. Thanks for being here at JMU.
Thank you, President Alger, for hosting this event on this amazing campus. I will say every time that I drive up here, I am struck yet again at just how much growth and how much beauty has taken place here. So congratulations and thank you again on that. Thank you also for your commitment to civic learning and engagement. Clearly something that is near and dear to your heart, and I appreciate your comments about the Council of Presidents being equally supportive. So thank you for that, and thank all of you for spending the day with us to discuss this increasingly important topic. For many years, Chev has identified civic learning and engagement as a vital element of higher education. And back in 2017, in its policy on student learning assessment and quality in undergraduate education, Chev broadly defined civic engagement as, and I quote, an array of knowledge, abilities, values, attitudes, and behaviors that in combination allow individuals to contribute to the civic life of their communities. It further stated, quote, that civic engagement may include, among other things, exploration of one's role and responsibilities in society, knowledge of and ability to engage with political systems and processes, and/or course-based or extracurricular efforts to identify and address issues of public or community concern. That same year, SCHEV, in collaboration with a task force made up of representatives from many of Virginia's colleges and universities, established civic engagement as a required competency, equally important to the other named competencies of critical thinking, written communication, and quantitative reasoning. Now, much has transpired since this initial commitment to civic engagement was made. We've experienced a pandemic that, for many schools, challenged enrollment and damaged balance sheets, and that created enormous stress and isolation for many of our students as they dealt with the impact of virtual learning. We've experienced, both directly and virtually, egregious examples of social injustice, as well as the disparate impact that the pandemic and associated recession had on marginalized populations. And we've seen the increased proliferation of both information and disinformation across social and other media platforms, creating even greater challenges in obtaining and filtering information needed to make decisions consistent with one's values and the well-being of our communities. Now, the reactions by colleges and universities to all of this have varied, but in almost all cases, institutions had to reprioritize and allocate more resources toward urgent short-term efforts associated with things like managing difficult financial situations, keeping students physically healthy, and supporting students' mental well-being. This latter, I will say, an effort that is a work in process and one that is worthy of its own day of dialogue sometime in the future. But in regard to civic learning and engagement, even though the underlying commitment remained, schools, understandably, were not able to devote as much time and attention to civic engagement as was initially envisioned. As we start to settle into our new normal, fully cognizant of the rough edges and unfinished business these past 2 years have shown us, SCHEV believes that it is crucial that we reinvigorate our efforts to ensure that all of our students in higher education in Virginia have the opportunity to develop this competency, and that we, as a state, continue to be a leader in this area. As a demonstration of this, SCHEV signed on to the shared commitment statement of the Civic Learning and Democracy Engagement Coalition, which makes the following 6 commitments. 1, affirm the civic mission of post-secondary education and take vigorous action to help higher education fulfill that mission. 2, showcase examples in our community of civic engagement and democracy learning at scale, involving all students, and especially students from communities that have been chronically underserved in U.S. society. 3, engage public and policy leaders with the importance of higher education's civic mission and the need to advance equity-committed civic learning in college. 4, support and align with educational reforms in P-12 civics and history that are also moving forward in U.S. states, communities, and schools. 5, work in our own contexts to provide high-quality civic learning for students, including connections between curricular and experiential learning, opportunities to work on significant public problems, practice in constructively engaging views different from one's own, and disaggregated evidence about what works and what needs improvement in students' experience of democracy learning. And 6, provide leaders and educators the support needed to deepen civic learning and democracy engagement in their own contexts to make equitable participation a documented achievement, and to work toward a common goal, creating a high-quality, civic-oriented post-secondary education for all U.S. students. So why make such a big public commitment? In short, it's because civic engagement matters. Studies have shown that students who are involved in civic engagement through the curriculum or extracurricular activities have better educational outcomes overall and express more satisfaction with their higher education experience. Employers value many of the skills that students develop through these experiences, including teamwork, ethical problem solving, and empathy, and our communities benefit by having citizens who will be more effective at using their talents to generate and support policies that make Virginia a great place to work and live. Chev takes a particular interest in all of this because it directly supports the achievement of our strategic plan entitled Pathways to Opportunity, the Virginia Plan for Higher Education, a plan that strives to build on the strengths of our current highly rated system and create one that is even more equitable, more affordable, and more transformative than what we have today. And the only way that that will happen is if we include in our priorities efforts to teach our students to be active and effective citizens and leaders within our communities. So thank you again for taking on this challenge. It's a broad one, and addressing it effectively can at times feel difficult and even risky. But I think we can all agree that it is an area that is ripe for innovation and well worth the effort. So I hope you enjoy the opportunity today to hear the perspectives of leaders from a wide variety of organizations and to discuss the topic with each other. And now I would like to invite members of our first panel to come on up to the stage. Thank you.
While our panelists are taking their seats, I'd like to remind you that we are using Slido for all questions and comments, whether you are in the room today or joining us from the live stream. That way everyone is on equal footing. The information is on the tables here. You can scan that QR code and go directly to the page where you can enter your questions and comments, and then everyone else will be able to see them, and you can upvote other people's comments so that we can know which questions you're most interested in when we get to the Q&A part of the panel. Thank you.
Okay, is this on? Yeah? Hi everyone, good morning. I'm Ashley Finley at the American Association of Colleges and Universities, and I'm just want to give another thank you to Jody. I hope you get lots of thank yous today, Jody. Just a really tremendous job organizing and bringing us together. The video was great. The video was awesome. You should all check that out and then steal the concept for your own work. And also the thank you too is just the brilliance and creativity of Jody to bring this panel together. We're really excited about this discussion. I can tell you we had a too short of a prep session for this. Really, we had like a whole hour and we filled it very quickly with a deep commitment to take on this idea of what exactly is the shifting context that we are in. And we agreed as a panel that we were gonna go for it. We were gonna lay it out there and really sort of raise some big issues to start the day and create some dialogue, if you will. So I just wanted to do a little bit of initial framing, and this is exactly from my notes from that conversation. These are not my own thoughts, but really sort of putting together some of the ideas that we had as a panel, and then we'll go into a couple of rounds of questions. We're going to keep it tight at 50 minutes, and hopefully have some opportunity for you all to engage as well with us before we break into small groups. So a couple of things that we talked about in terms of the shifting context. We thought, well, we really need to think about, well, what is the context now? And part of that is a recognition, and President Alger set this up very nicely, a recognition that as we do our civic engagement work, it is not a partisan, it's no longer a nonpartisan environment. We have to do that with the consideration that our students are surrounded by partisanship and how that affects ideas, how that affects the language that we use when we engage in this work at a state level, for example. Issues around truth, who holds truth, and balancing that with our commitment as institutions of higher education to commit to telling the truth and also recognizing that we have a commitment to freedom of expression. So the real tension between those things. And then finally, a recognition that we've always grappled with issues of power, when we talk about civic engagement, but this is now a time of reconciling a twin pandemic, of course, and the racial injustice that we've confronted anew, and recognizing that everything we do now really necessitates a lens of equity and the power dynamics within that. So how do we balance these things? What are some of our big questions? I think our panelists will get to that, so I'm eager to get to it. So by way of introduction, and if you saw the video, you know I'm not introducing anyone. So by way of introductions, and which is a sneaky way of other people remembering your titles, and then I don't have to remember your titles, is to ask this question from the lens of what you do around civic engagement, as a way of each of our panelists introducing themselves to you. What are the things that keep you up at night? What are the things that really concern you about this moment? And I'll start with Dr. Scheck-Snyder.
Good morning, Alvin Scheck-Snyder. Is this on? It is not on. Now it's on. Good morning, Alvin Scheck-Snyder. I'm on the State Council for Higher Education. I am a political scientist by background and training, if I can still claim that. I grew up in Lake Charles, Louisiana, and on the Gulf Coast of Louisiana. So in my college years were, sandwiched between the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. And so, many of my thoughts and concerns about civic engagement have been shaped by those experiences. What keeps me up at night with regard to this topic is the pervasiveness of misinformation, disinformation, and how this has seeped into not only our civic discourse, but into our politics. I frankly consider that frightening, and it's something that I think we need to attack head on. I'll stop there.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Marisol Morales, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Carnegie Elective Classifications with the American Council on Education, and prior to that role, I was at Campus Compact. So, I'm born and raised in Chicago, and I guess first on my mind is the issues of violence that we're seeing in our communities and how that impacts people's ability to sort of connect, be engaged civically, even want to go out of their house to do things. Additionally, I agree around the misinformation, but more importantly, I think I fear that our college leaders and our campuses are not bold and courageous enough to stand up against the politics of this moment, push back against the repressive laws that are being passed to attack education, and really, especially around the sort of campaign against critical race theory and the misinformation that's coming out about that. And that now is the time to, figure out opportunities to stand together, push forward against these, this repressive legislation that's coming out at the state level, and really be a more collective voice for higher education across the country.
Hi, everybody. I'm Vanessa Diamond. I'm with the Community Foundation in Greater Richmond, so I'm the non-academic perspective on things. I would say from my field, the things that we're really grappling with is the idea of civic knowledge, both from those within university settings or corporate settings or faith-based settings or general volunteers. Really, the lack of general awareness of the context of why these issues occur. And often people come to us and they think there's like this easy button that like it can just be fixed. And a lot of the issues we're all grappling with have been humanities issues for millennia. We're talking housing, we're talking inequality, we're talking, getting jobs and workforce, and there aren't easy fixes. And I think there's a tension sometimes, particularly if we want to talk about higher ed, something that keeps me up at night, is the tension from universities expecting the nonprofit sector to be their learning lab. And they don't have the capacity for that. and they're working very under-resourced communities, trying to do incredible work. And I think we've got to figure out a better way to build relationships between institutions like higher ed and corporate partners, so that it's really mutually beneficial.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Quentin Kidd, Christopher Newport University. I'm a political scientist by training, but I've been in administration for almost a decade, so I'm almost where you are. Not sure I can claim. So the way I came to the civic engagement sort of question is through my research. I'm a political behaviorist, so I study, why people, vote the way they vote, do the things they do, and in the context of doing that kind of work, I wandered over to the place or the role of institutions in all of that. And normally the sociologists hang out at, studying the institutions, and the political scientists focus on the individuals. But I wandered over looking at the role of institutions in encouraging or discouraging or changing the landscape of civic engagement over time. And so I think what keeps me up at night as I think about this is the role of institutions in both multiple areas, making it harder for people to know how to engage, making it more difficult for people to engage, changing the sort of incentive structure to engage or disengage. We could talk about this forever, but all of the institutions that, if we read about in the history books of the early part of this nation's history, all of those institutions that encouraged a particular kind of civic participation, civic engagement, have changed radically as the nation has changed over time, and both discourage engagement or make engagement more contentious. And the one area that really keeps me up deep into the night is our increasing distrust of government and the institutions of government, because I think that's sort of fundamental, existential in some ways. If we lose trust in the institutions of our government, then we sort of lose trust in everything else. And I think we're at a point here where we've lost enough trust in the institutions of government that we're sort of at a precipice as a country. And so I think institutions and the role of institutions are at the heart of a lot of this. So I'll stop there and go on.
This is indicative of the range of perspectives that the panel brings, the range of work that happens in this space, and I think a range of the similar perspectives to consider on your own campuses. One of the things that came up in our introductory conversation or prep session for the panel was the idea of how do we take seriously our commitment as institutions to prepare students to be part of a democracy that we increasingly know is imperfect. That increasing awareness of, again, who has access to those resources, how do we properly engage community members in a reciprocal and respectful relationship. And I think an important other issue that got raised as well is who gets centered in that conversation. I think that came up quite a bit too in some of the responses here. Where are those focal points? As we talked through even our conversation and thought about why we want to raise these topics now, what makes the current climate particularly hard, we also wanted to think about, well, what makes the current climate particularly hopeful and particularly opportunistic for this work. So I wanted to ask a follow-up. So what is it about this time and where we're going that makes you hopeful for change in civic engagement and the change in the ways that we're educating students on campuses to be engaged citizens? Dr. Scheck-Schneider, do you want to?
Yeah, why not?
We'll work down the line once more, and then we'll
down the
mess
line.
it up.
Okay, all right, yes, right. Well, I think this is as good a time as any, frankly. It's interesting how even when a new president is elected, how quickly we turn our attention to midterm elections. And so even now we're talking about, midterm elections. And then, 2024 is the incumbent going to run for office again. is he too old? And you know, should we have a complete sweep of top leadership in Washington? So I think this is as good a time as any. I had an interesting conversation with President Alger before we got started today. He mentioned having attended this conference in Qatar. I've been intrigued by how the rest of the world is viewing what's going on now. I mean, you know, we're in this bubble, and we are noted for our strong defense of democracy. But the world is watching us, and they're watching how we're responding, because there are, you know, many ascending, aspiring nations that believe in what we have believed in, who are wondering, you know, is this going to work? So we are at, whether we like it or not, we are at an inflection point, and I think it's something that is going to require intentional leadership. But it can't all be at the top. It has to begin at the level at which we're having this conversation. And I think it's incumbent upon those of us who really believe in this experiment called democracy to seize this moment and to embrace it with enthusiasm, and to show the world that we really do believe in this, and that it is something that we're committed to.
For me, my family's originally from Puerto Rico, and so I think about what happened after Hurricane Maria, and in the midst of the government not coming through for the people during that disaster, the people came through for themselves. They self-organized, they created mutual aid networks to get themselves through these moments of difficulty until some order could be restored, some normalcy, all of that. Those are the seeds of civic engagement that last longer than any one person in office. Those were the seeds that created the movement to remove a corrupt governor from power in Puerto Rico, that was fueled by impressive investigative journalism from journalists on the island who were paying attention. And for me, those seeds exist here and will need to start existing. The pandemic showed that, the ways our institutions, you know, in sort of with speed lightning jumped into supporting communities, right? Ways that we never saw institutions of higher ed be so nimble. They figured out a way to be nimble in the pandemic. We figured out a way to feed each other, to help each other, to care for each other. And not during a time where it was easy, but during a time that it was difficult. We had people who were in the medical professions going, you know, staying in there helping, even during exhaustion. So for me, those are the things that keep me hopeful about what we are to see in the future. This is an experiment, right? This United States. And so we are in that moment of experimentation. We're at that moment of trial. And we have to think about what intentionality we're bringing into our society to help get us through this. Spaces like this, focusing on dialogue, thinking about the ways young people can be involved, because they're the ones who are going to have to carry this. I have a son who's 18 years old, and I'm hopeful when I talk to him. His level of awareness, his level of connection, his knowledge of the importance of connection, especially because he experienced something different during the pandemic when he wasn't able to be in those spaces. And so I'm hoping that that will bring us towards each other more fully. I'm hoping that this moment, right, especially as we're seeing all this violence happening, this continuation of mass shootings, will make us say, no, this is not the society we can continue to live in, and we're gonna have to dedicate ourselves to creating something different. And I think in terms of the work of the classifications, I'm hopeful for the direction that is going to both think about public purpose at the center of the community engagement elective and all the other electives that we're going to be developing, And so really having institutions think about what their public purpose is in order to gain this recognition and connect it back to things like student learning outcomes, community partnerships, and reciprocity, but get back to the core. And for me, it's also move away from sort of the neoliberal universities that we have been seeing and back to what is our purpose? What are those values that we say? Because we're not going to continue to function as a society or as institutions within the society to uphold democracy if we don't get back to those core values. And I think lastly, the centering of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the conversation and the lexicon of this nation now, even as difficult as it is, the focusing of that in the classifications is really important, because that means that we can no longer put people in the shadows behind a curtain and only focus on one community and one group. And the more we're able to bring those diverse voices, we can actually then talk about what is democracy, because we really haven't had it for a large portion of communities of color in this nation since its founding. And so now we can actually start having the conversation.
Well, there's so much. I think what makes me hopeful is we have personal stories, right? So you heard personal story about her child or where she grew up, and what those impacts make on our history and our ancestry. I'm a first-generation American. My parents were South African and Jewish, so they fled, their grandparents fled Lithuania and then ended up in another oppressive society. Then they ended up coming here, right? Those storylines, no matter where you're coming from, our histories are following us and telling us something, and we need to be listening. And I think the fact that we are curious about those stories now is helping us see that there is a better way. My work in civic engagement, I started in AmeriCorps in '97 when it first started, and my whole career has been civic engagement and volunteerism, and it's because my parents always asked me to question why. Why is it like this? What does it mean for us to look at a society or a rule or a culture around us and everyone tells us it's okay, and for you to know in your heart that it's not? And then what does it take to turn that person into someone that's going to take action? And that is scary and it is hard, but I see it more and more every day that more people are willing to say, hey, that's not okay. That's not right. What are we going to do? How are we going to change policies, procedures, culture, behavior of our institutions, of our families, of our neighborhoods, of our schools, and of our government? And I think that curiosity is what brings me hope. I have a 12-year-old who has gone through a major, devastating mental health crisis this year that has rocked my family. And at the core of it, she thinks society is super messed up. And the stuff that she asked me about, I can't answer, because it is. But the fact that she's willing to ask me about it and struggle with it and try to build resilience, I think that's the hope we all need. Beyond the academics, is really that in the end, we're human beings trying to create a more perfect world for ourselves and our families, and that is really beautiful. That's what motivates me to build programs and partnerships and all the tactical things that we do, but we've got to really start with that why component of really trying to kind of create a better world for ourselves, for our families, and for everyone in our communities. And then on a whole other tactical side of something that brings me hope is we're looking at civic engagement very differently. It is not we're hoping, or we're trying to move out of a charity-based I give you, to really centering individuals that are dealing with the crisis, whether it's health or educational or poverty. How do we help center people into their own storyline? But then also, as people who want to build a better world, how do we look beyond just volunteerism or philanthropy? How do we change the policies of our work environments? How do we look at where we live? How do we look at where we invest our own money? How do we look at how we vote, how we learn? And so really thinking about volunteerism and philanthropy or civic engagement as one component of what it means to be civically active. There's so many ways that are more holistic that really meet a variety of people where they are. So it's diversifying who can participate. Because not everyone has the privilege of time or money. But they do have voice, they do have network, they do have knowledge and influence, and we've really got to be able to look at that wholeness that people can bring to the work.
So to pick up on a couple of points, the next generation. So what makes me hopeful? You know, I've spent 25 years on a campus hanging around with 18 to 22-year-olds, and that's what makes me hopeful. You know, Gen Z now, but Gen X before them. You know, in some ways, you know, we went through something like this as a nation in the early part of the 20th century, you know, the Gilded Age and the pushback to all of that. That's where a lot of the institutions of civic engagement that were not, you know, governmental institutions or, you know, the political economy, et cetera, but a lot of the organizations that, you know, people's parents and grandparents were parts of that don't seem to be that active anymore. That's when a lot of those things got started. And they got started because, you know, people, you know, essentially came out of a post-Civil War era and wanted to rebuild their communities or build their communities or recover in some way civically. And in some ways, I feel like we're going through something like that again. You know, we're sort of in the free market of civic engagement. We always are. And I see young people going out and creating. You know, they're going out and, you know, starting organizations, starting things, getting involved in new organizations. And, you know, like the free market economy, a lot of them last for a few years and then they die off. But some of them stick and build. And so it's really the next generation that makes me feel hopeful, because if, you know, like the political economy that can fall apart once in a while, you know, I hope we're not at an early stage of the equivalent of a Great Depression in our democracy. But I worry about it. I think we're at the equivalent of something like a recession in our democracy. And what happens when you have a recession is, you know, the economy it goes through, you know, and it sort of kills off the weak parts of the economy, and the stronger parts then become stronger and thrive. And so if in my idealistic world we're going through something similar to that in civic engagement, it's the next generation that's going to be the generation that builds the new institutions, community institutions, state-level institutions, national-level institutions, international-level institutions, that basically revive the civic engagement life of the country, like organizations revive the political economy of the country after a recession. And so that's sort of what makes me hopeful, is I see it. You know, on campus every day, I see that stuff sort of happening. And I think it's happening all over the country. You know, not just on college campuses, but in communities, you know, everywhere it's happening. And so hopefully we look back 20 years from now and we say, you know, it was essentially the millennials and Gen Z that kind of revived the civic engagement of the country. And we'll point to major institutions or major community organizations that were started by some of them. I hope some in Virginia that go on to sort of shape the nation in some ways. But that's what I hope is happening. That's what keeps me hopeful anyway.
So I'm envisioning these points of light as you guys tackled the hope question. To maybe add an even finer point on, or an additional point on what we're seeing in terms of age differences, I thought it would just sneak in this quick thing that we found on AAC&U's most recent employer survey from 2021. We've talked a bit about learning outcomes. President Alger brought those up. And AAC&U's been doing employer studies for 15 years. And consistently among outcomes like written communication, critical thinking, so forth, when you get to sort of what we might call the civic outcomes, they tend to rank much lower. Important, but much, much lower on these little things. In our most recent study, it finally occurred to us to disaggregate by we did by a bunch of factors, but including age. And it was the only factor in which we found a significant and enduring trend across the data. And that trend was that employers under the age of 40 compared to employers over the age of 50 consistently valued outcomes related to civic engagement and experiences related to civic engagement in the magnitude of 20 to 30 percentage points higher. So if I would sneak in one little data point, we will keep looking at it. We'll keep looking at different samples and keep studying that trend, but it's a really interesting point on who are the employers under the age of 40? It's the oldest millennials. And are we in fact going to, what I hope see is this blurring of lines between one's civic life and one's professional life and one's individual life, and hopefully that becomes a kind of pervasive mindset. So leading into a next question, and then I'm going to sneak in one last one for the panelists, and we're going to, let's just mix it up. Whoever feels it should just jump in. It was important to us as we had our conversation to think about what was hard about this and to name that. Talk a little bit about what made us hopeful for that change. But we know that we're looking at a room full of practitioners in one way or another. You are living this. And I think more importantly, I think always in these conversations, you are ambassadors for this work on your campuses. We know you're talking to people. You are the change agents leading the work on the campus. We don't have to change your mind, but how do we equip you with some skills and some talking points to maybe, change some other people's minds and get them engaged to come with you in this effort. So we really wanted to end with some advice. And that was, so now from your esteemed panelists, from your vantage point, what advice would you give in moving from talk to action? Because we know there's plenty of talk in this space. How do we move from talk to action? And Vanessa? You were leaning in. You seem so intrigued.
Very engaged. Okay. So the three things that I was thinking through that would move really, like I would recommend you consider. One is, and I can send you information, and there's actually a couple of our partners from University of Richmond and VCU here, is really think about what a regional partnership with other universities or higher education, nonprofits, foundations, and other mobilizers in your area. We have something in Richmond called RVA Engage that we co-founded probably about, 7 or 8 years ago. And we meet regularly, and we hash some stuff out. We've had meetings where we've had 30 or 40 nonprofits and 20 or 30 corporate partners, faith-based institutions, representatives from higher ed, those institutions that are sending their employees and students out, and those nonprofits that are intaking and partnering on the learning and the civic, and we've hashed some stuff out. We've talked about the inequalities, we've talked about the pressure, we've talked about the difficulty of building that relationship. And we've spun a lot of projects out of that. We developed something called the Principles of Engagement, which is on the website, which took 2 years to write, which is really our code of kind of how we want to work together as a better ecosystem. We've developed a learning series, both for students, for faculty, and for community members to learn about core issues in our community called Civic Academy. We've developed workshops for nonprofits that help them better understand how to work with institutions of higher ed and how to work with corporate partners. So we're really thinking about what it means to build that ecosystem between the universities, between nonprofits and faith organizations, so that we can work better together and we can really think about equalizing out that power structure.
So a couple of things. One, is that I think it's really important for institutions to recognize and acknowledge the reputation of harm with the community. And so spending some time truth-telling, truth-seeking for yourselves and putting that out there, I think that's the first path to real engagement. And in addition to that, really centering healing in the partnerships, thinking about people-centered approaches, recognizing people's time and effort, creating enough space, removing the sense of urgency that sometimes happens when we're trying to plan for service learning courses or civic engagement, and give yourselves and the community partners enough space to do this. Really think about what the civic piece means with the context of citizenship and without the context of citizenship. I think oftentimes we talk about educating citizens, but we know we're missing a whole huge part of our communities who are also really active in helping to better and support our communities and actually working towards democracy without papers, right? And so thinking about how we expand our notion and discussion of citizenship so that it is as broad and diverse as the people who make up our communities. And lastly, like, listen to young people. We need to get out of their way and just figure out ways to support them so they can, you know, in some ways clean up our mistakes and put a vision to this world that is much more connected, much more diverse, much more welcoming and inclusive than anything that we have previously experienced.
Are you sure you don't want to? So I would say, you know, a lot of my experiences on a college campus, two things. Recognize the breadth of what civic engagement means. Because I do think sometimes it's easy to sort of get narrow cast into our sort of view of what civic engagement means, and we sort of forget that it's, you know, it's an umbrella as large as, you know, whatever we want it to be. It does involve elements that are really difficult and aspects that are really difficult to navigate. Politics is really difficult to navigate these days. I have noticed younger people over the years, I guess less so Gen Z, more so latter millennials, really didn't want to keep, you know, sort of an arm's length from politics, and so they went out and did their own things, you know, to solve problems in other ways besides politics. I think the students coming in now are more willing to engage in politics and sort of the messiness of that. But, you know, issues of race, issues of poverty, issues of historical, you know, aspects like redlining and stuff like that, we have to be willing to lean into all of that stuff, because all of that is a part of civic engagement, and all of that has to be addressed, or sort of there's a rot at the core. You know, we can't sort of fix things around it and ignore or avoid the really difficult aspects, or the rot at the core continues. Mm-hmm. So that's one piece of advice. The other piece of advice is to sort of, you know, say again, get out of the way of our students, essentially, who are going to go do things, and encourage them, help them. Also recognize that not all of them are going to do things that make sense to you or to me, but that's the free market of ideas, and you've got to let that get out into the community and fail miserably or succeed wonderfully, and that's essentially where we're going to. That's where those new institutions are going to emerge from. You know, there are going to be thousands of failures for every one minor success, and, you know, hundreds of thousands of failures for the one big thing that shapes the course of your community, your nation, you know, in years to come. So I think we have to be willing to recognize the breadth of what we're talking about, lean into the difficult, dirty parts of it, messy parts of it, and then get out of the way and let people, especially our students, go into it and engage.
I just offer, you know, one brief footnote, and that is, at various points in his presidency, President Obama talked about when there was some big incident or crisis, you know, we're on this journey to create a more perfect union, you know, to create a more perfect union. And I think opportunities present themselves at different times and at different levels. And wherever we find that opportunity to create that more perfect union, we should seize it. It doesn't have to be anything esoteric or fancy. Your comments, Quentin, about the early 20th century reminded me of a time when civic leagues were very popular. I did my graduate work in the Chicago area, and civic engagement was expressed through these civic leagues, and so they're neighborhood organizations. Many of us live in communities where there are homeowner associations. I belong to one, and I walk into the meeting, and every face, with one exception, is a white male. And I belong to this group, but I've spent my entire life, as have some others in this room, fighting this battle alone. So wherever you are, in whatever venue you find yourself in, there are lots of opportunities, and so it doesn't have to be anything fancy, and it cannot all occur in Washington or in the state houses. It has to happen where you are.
Can I just follow? I would also add, a more perfect union is not predefined. And a lot of our political and social fights right now are about what a more perfect union means. And that's totally fine. I mean, that's what we should have the debate about what that means. But I think it's incumbent upon us also not to define for our students what a more perfect union means. Give them the information, the education to sort of think through that themselves. But that's literally at the heart of what we're trying to do. And it's undefined.
Okay, wonderful job. I think taking seriously the idea of a dialogue, we want to open this up for the magic of Slido. What could be the magic of Slido? Or humans? Yeah. Okay. Should we just do that, or should we just do questions from Slido?
We're going to use Slido because the audience is able to put in their questions in Slido. Okay. So please do that. And the power of the thumbs have entered questions. We're only going to be able to take one. So the one that has risen to the top based upon votes is, how can campus leaders be bold and take a stand against the violence and legislation that has taken shape in our states and in our world? Campus leaders be bold and take stand against the violence and legislation.
For me, everything comes down to like basic community organizing techniques. And, I think we have to step away from this is hard because I work for ACE, but step away from sort of the big lobby pieces of it. There's an important piece for that. But I think at the end of the day, it is the on the ground boots, going into communities, having conversations with folks, thinking about like, what does it mean to be a good neighbor? How do we work together to then push back against some of particularly the legislation that's coming down? People are voting for fear right now, right? And so as institutions of higher ed who are about knowledge, right? I think knowledge is liberty. How do we create spaces on our campus to share with folks like what the different decisions mean, right? How do we have them workshop all of these different pieces that are coming out so that when they go to the ballot box, they actually understand what they're voting for? There's all this sort of language around anti-CRT and what it means, and most of it is BS. It's not even what CRT is. And so we've got institutions of higher ed that can create spaces for us to just talk and learn and ask questions, and in spaces that, hopefully will allow people to put down some of the barriers and fear of asking questions, right? So that they can actually get to the core of these things. So I think part of it is being bold locally and getting in the neighborhoods and having these conversations, and then taking that and helping people figure out how to take that to the ballot box and how to organize spaces for voice. Again, back to sort of community organizing 101.
I would say it's easier to. I think it's a really scary space for a lot of people on college campuses. But it's easier to, I think, engage locally on an issue. I think, most of our universities are sort of really well known in our area might be known in the state, but then, nationally, less known. So it's a little, your credibility, I think, sort of loses itself a little bit the further you get from your campus or your community. So I think it's a little bit easier to engage in problem solving and really difficult things that happen in your community first. And that isn't an easy answer to, some piece of legislation that might be working its way through Capitol Hill. But I think you have to find a way to engage that stuff locally, because that's where our credibility is as institutions. That's where our faculty live, our staff live, our students are around the community all the time. So that's where our credibility is. I think we have to engage mostly where our credibility is. I think that's where most of it's going to happen in a good way.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Unfortunately, we only have time for that one question today. Oh, I can do one more? Yay. Okay, next on the list. All right. Slido is telling me the next question is. The next question is relating to concern that we could reach a point of no return. And so I think we may have addressed it some with talking about how there is still hope. So if okay, I'm going to move on to the next one in the list. And that says, what are ways for higher education institutions to build better collaborations with the nonprofit sector that are not exploitive of already under-resourced organizations, but rather support those organizations and their mission? You feel that? I feel like you're feeling that question.
I am. I'm feeling that question. I mean, even just asking that question now matters, and you should continue to ask it in every meeting you're in every program you're developing. Is how do we do this better? How do we communicate? I did bring, because I'm super nerdy. I mean, not as nerdy as you guys, because you're academics, but I did bring our regional commitment to civic engagement guiding principles. I brought 3 or 4 of them. I'll put them up here for you. Go through this process that we went through in Richmond with your community partners. Ask them what they need. Build relationships with them. I think, a lot of the stuff we've talked about here is about being human, building relationships and trust. Like, we all represent institutions and organizations, but we're also people building relationships with people. And I think that's how you build and sustain better partnerships with your nonprofit partners, with your civic organizations and your civic leagues and the neighbors. But you got to show up, and you got to keep showing up for the long term. And it can't be extractive. It can't be built on your semesters. People don't understand your semester calendars. They don't know about your quarters and your exams and your fall breaks. That doesn't mean anything to them. They're living their regular calendar lives. So really thinking about the language you use and like the pacing, and really that on whose time is this. And so I will leave these here for you. I know there's a couple people here from VCU and UR that have participated in this process with us. It has been a really incredible coalition because it's been 7 years, and we meet pretty regularly, and we talk about a lot of stuff. And I think it takes those long conversations and the relationships. It's not a transactional semester by semester kind of experience, because this is other people's everyday lives.
I wanted to connect just one quick point that Quentin mentioned. One action step you can do is expand your notion of what civic engagement means. And in tying that back to what Vanessa just said, actually, is when you do that, you can expand your notion of who a community partner is. And I think sometimes the trap that we fall into on campuses is we go back to the same well with all of the students, because we simply haven't talked to our colleagues about undergraduate research, community-based research, clinicals, a real internships, a real range of thinking about where does this work happen? Where are we actually exposing students to these skills? So in part, and I really appreciate the point about relationship building, sometimes we got to really think about doing that on our own campuses and having those conversations and that dialogue and who you invite into that.
I think that is the last question, but I actually have one more. I get the power of being at the podium. And this actually has been posted. Is everyone ready for a good day of conversation? Yes. Okay. So thank you panel.
Thank you.
I also love that Jody said I could be behind the podium or grab the hand mic because she could tell that you wouldn't be able to see me at all. You would just hear like this very weird voice all by itself. So thank you again to this incredible panel for such an engaging and inspiring set of comments. I believe that all of you probably feel the same way I do about that. I'm Danielle Leek. I'm from Reynolds Community College in Richmond, and I'm so excited to be here with all of you today. So before we make our next transition, I'm going to ask Jody to go ahead and change the slide. And if you are joining us from home, you will be able to participate, or from wherever you are, but not here in the room, you will be able to participate as well. But I'd like to ask all of you to take a second to look at the slide above my head and choose the focus that you would like to have for your discussion during our next session. And note the room that you might like to be in for that conversation. And if you are not here physically, you'll be joining virtually using a Jamboard. And you had the link for that Jamboard in the materials that you received prior to our meeting. We're going to get started in about 10 minutes. But this morning, our panelists shared both challenges and hopes for civic learning and engagement. And it'll be our turn to break into groups, to name the barriers and most importantly share ideas and resources, complementing what we've already heard and maybe coming to look at some of the materials maybe that Vanessa has brought because it'll relate to our conversation, to reduce the negative impact of the barriers that we come to agree upon or find in our shared conversation, the barriers that we have in our work. So these groups are based on 3 broad areas. The first, community and civic engagement in student programming. The second, classroom teaching and faculty development. And the third, campus and community relationships. So please choose one of these 3 areas to focus on, but please don't feel constrained. In other words, you shouldn't feel obligated to choose an area based on your current role, but please choose something that's of interest to you. I mean, that's the nature of civic engagement. Expand your notion of civic engagement maybe in the work that you've already done. And you'll choose the room. This is ballroom A. Behind me back there is ballroom C. And over here, if you'll come this direction, will be ballroom B. Okay? So those will be the 3 ballrooms. And we'll be talking about 3 questions as part of these discussions. So hopefully you've had a chance to kind of see some of the examples of what the conversations will be about. And I'll ask Jody to move on to the next slide. So the 3 questions that we'll discuss in each of our groups. And again, if you're participating from a virtual space, you'll be sharing your answers to these questions on a Jamboard. So the first, what barriers or roadblocks are you experiencing in your work? And you'll have access to these questions inside of your collaboration space. I just want to give you a chance to think about these before we break. Second, what would success look like for you? What would it feel like for you if we were able to overcome those roadblocks? And third, what steps have you taken, either in your own personal work or on your campus, to overcome roadblocks? We hope that this shared conversation will inspire us all to think about the ways that we do our work in civic engagement. And I'm so looking forward to being a part of one of these conversations and hearing about what you discuss during these breakouts. So we'll take just a few minutes. Jody, would you like to confirm the time that you'd like everybody to start their breakout? 11:20. Excellent. So thank you again to our fine panelists. We'll see you in a few minutes, and I believe there might be some snacks out in the foyer if you need a bit of refreshment.
We are about to start the second plenary, and I would just like to remind everyone about Slido again. So if you did not take advantage of it in the first session, there was a nice little back and forth going on there as people were replying to each other's comments. So it's kind of like a Twitter back channel, but just for us. So I encourage you to go to slido.com or scan that QR code so that you can post your comments and questions. Thanks.
Okay, that's on now, right? You can hear me. Always difficult to have a session right after lunch, but we'll figure out a way for you not to be lethargic. I think our first panel really got us off to a great start this morning. I'm Ron Kutcher, President Emeritus and University Professor at the University of Richmond, and I'm not going to introduce my fellow panelists for this panel on civic learning and engagement in a polarized society. I have a couple of questions I'm going to ask them, and we plan to leave some time for you to ask questions as well. I'm going to begin with some framing remarks, and we're just going to get started. In an increasingly polarized world, it has become almost impossible to have authentic conversations across different perspectives from race and gender to politics and ideology. But the vigorous debate of competing ideas has been an essential component of well-functioning democratic societies for centuries. And yet, in today's climate, the various ideological factions not only congregate in like-minded bubbles, but they also are reluctant to interact with, or in some cases, even vilify those in the opposing bubbles. This is not good for our society and for our democracy. As an educator, I have been especially alarmed to see how the politics and rhetoric inflaming our country have increasingly spilled over to foment campus climates in which even the most innocent inquiry can become suspect, and students are reluctant to engage in discussions regarding controversial ideas. In fact, this morning, you may have seen in Inside Higher Education, a new survey, 63.5% of students are reluctant to express themselves freely. And then there was another recent survey, 6 out of 10 students today can recall an instance when they self-censored opinions because they worried how their peers or professors would respond. Now, while self-censorship is not necessarily bad, it can inhibit open and honest discussion in an academic setting. After all, the process of intellectual inquiry and authentic civic engagement requires, in my opinion, the discussion of competing ideas. However, it is impossible to have this kind of discourse if one is afraid of making a mistake or offending or asking an insensitive question. In fact, Jonathan Rauch, in his insightful book, and I would commend this book to you if you haven't read it, The Constitution of Knowledge in Defense of Truth, states, quote, "Self-censorship is part of a living together, what we call courtesy, but not when it impedes honest conversation and criticism in university intellectual life, where honest conversation and criticism are the whole point of being there," end of quote. People who are willing to step outside the comfort of their own ideological bubble, who can openly and energetically disagree without acrimony or without threat or retaliation, are now something of an endangered species. And that is disrupting the entire ecosystem of our democracy, whose very health and ability to breathe freely depends on the energetic exchange of diverse and competing ideas. Now, as John reminded us this morning, our framers said they were setting out to form a more perfect union. I often say to our students that the American democracy is not a fully fledged adult. At best, it's an emerging adult. So we have to work hard to sustain it. And so that leads me into my first question. And what I'm going to do is I'm not going to introduce our panelists. I'm going to ask them to each introduce themselves to you as they share with you their wisdom. So the first question, what words of wisdom or advice would you offer to anyone in higher education, or perhaps to a particular constituency, faculty, staff, trustees, student affairs, board members to improve the climate for civic learning and engagement at this time in our history. Turn to you, Dave.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon. I'm David Ramadan with the Schar School at George Mason University. I can't start without thanking Dr. Fissler for this. This has been an incredible morning so far, and Dr. Alger for having us. Beautiful campus. I do want one of those purple constitutions for my collection before I leave. So a short introduction. I'm an immigrant. I was born and raised in Beirut, Lebanon, in the midst of a devastating civil war. I arrived on the shores of these great United States of America at the age of 19 with $2,000 in my pocket and a dream. A dream that led me to Jefferson's house. I was elected to serve twice in Mr. Jefferson's house, becoming the first adult immigrant in Virginia's history and the oldest running legislature in the New World. I credit that to my alma mater, to George Mason. I credit that to the lessons that I learned on campus, to the civic engagement that I was part of on campus. As I grew up in life, I kept that connection. I'm an adjunct faculty, so I'm a part-time academician. I teach in the Schar School of Government. I was a part-time civil servant legislator for 2 terms. And in the business world, I earned my living from consulting and now with the Noodle Corporation, which is an educational services online company. So I come to this from multiple frames: frame of an immigrant, a frame of a minority immigrant, a frame of an academician, and a frame of a legislator. And I go back to when I was asked, what would be the words of wisdom? Well, I'm not going to give you my words of wisdom, right? Even though I've had a great American story and great success, I don't see myself somebody giving wisdom. But I found a quote that I want you all to think of. Words of Frederick Douglass. He said, "It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men." Think about that for a second. It's easier to build strong children, and here we can substitute children with college students, right, than to repair broken men. I'll leave you with that.
All right, my name is Jackie Pfeffer-Merrill, and I'm the director of the Campus Free Expression Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C. And I want to say the Bipartisan Policy Center is the only organization registered in the District of Columbia that has the name bipartisan in its name. And that's really why we are involved in these campus issues. We really want to have a role in supporting colleges and universities in preparing the next generation for civic leadership and respectful conversations across principled disagreement. So in that capacity, it was my pleasure to serve as staff to Ronald Kretcher and the other members of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Academic Leaders Task Force, and we brought out a report, Campus Free Expression, a New Roadmap, and it's available if you give me your card, or you can download it from our website. And in this context, I also want to mention that I started my career as a faculty member in the Department of Government at the College of William and Mary. So I'm going to offer 2 pieces of wisdom. And the first is that on this civic engagement issue, it is so important to directly address, and by saying and by showing students that diversity and inclusion is not only compatible with, but can further open inquiry and discourse across difference. The Knight Foundation survey found this year that 66% of students think that free speech is frequently or occasionally in conflict with diversity and inclusion. And we can't really have the tough conversations that we need to have on our campuses in the country about equity, about race, about sex and gender and religion if we don't persuade students that we can really have a climate for open inquiry and also an inclusive, respectful learning environment for all. And the second piece of wisdom I'm going to offer, and I want to frame this in the context that I tweeted out how excited I was that the class of 2026 is going to receive a purple Constitution, as President Alger told us today, and is a grateful, naturalized American citizen. I think it can often be very helpful for students to frame why it is that we have really open inquiry in terms of the collegiate mission rather than in terms of the First Amendment. The First Amendment rightly protects speech that is hateful, that is vile, that is patently untrue, that is meant to provoke. It's not good that people do that, but the First Amendment protects it, and it does so as an individual right. But in a collegiate learning community, we are members of a purpose-driven community, and the reason why we have open exchange is so that we can question, we can offer statements that we think are true or offered in pursuit of truth, and we can support the ability of others to participate in that conversation. So as much as I love the First Amendment and think we obviously, public institutions have an obligation to uphold it, and it's important to teach about it, I think sometimes we go further when we say to students, yes, there's the First Amendment, but we have open inquiry not because the First Amendment made us do it, but because that's really why you're here and why we're all here on a college campus.
Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Page, and I am the director of the Office of Multicultural Affairs at Longwood University. And I have to tell you how exciting it is for me to be back in the Valley. This is a second home. JMU is my alma mater. I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that. But really, part and parcel of sort of how I view and how I have come to really understand and appreciate civic engagement was really founded here at this institution. And if you look behind me and you see the crest of JMU, you see the motto underneath it, knowledge is liberty. And so that's something that was impressed upon us, right from day one. But not only that, if we looked at what was then sort of the motto of the institution, which was be the change, which is now, translated into now being the change. It's more active. And so when I think about, sort of what civic engagement is, and what I was taught, is this notion that civic engagement is work that you do with other people, with the community, as opposed to the community, on the community, or for the community. And so when we sort of put it in that context, we begin to understand what's important, the community stakeholders. We begin to understand that it's very important for us to think about three key elements, which is how are we going to build capacity, of the stakeholders, the people with whom we are working? How are we going to make sure that these activities are sustainable? And third, how are they going to be mutually beneficial? And so as I think back to, again, words of wisdom, words of advice, more things that I've learned along the way as observations, it's that when we think about polarization, one of the key elements of polarization is partisanship. And I think to one of the quotes that Bill Moyer said that really resonated with me is we need to focus more on being citizens than being partisans. And so because one of the things, and Dr. Crutcher pointed it out in his opening framing, is when we think about partisanship and what does that mean, it essentially puts us in our own echo chamber. It puts us in a bubble of like-minded individuals. And the challenge of that is we're not really open to other perspectives, other ideas, other ways of knowing, other ways of learning. And that really is detrimental. And so when we have to look at the various ways in which opinions and ideas are a spectrum, and that how can we burst through that echo chamber? How can we learn and develop the capacity for working with other people, with understanding other people's perspectives? And the other key element that I think about most, if I were to pass along a word of wisdom, it's how can we begin to address what we call civic deserts that are existing on a lot of our campuses? And what we mean by that is there are a number of institutions, and research bears this out, where students do not have the opportunity to really engage with others in terms of having those difficult dialogues, those difficult conversations. And so it essentially becomes a civic desert. People stick to themselves. And so one of the things that is really incumbent upon us, in higher education, is to create those spaces, create those opportunities whereby we can engage with what we deem to be the other. Because again, we have to push through our fear. The notion of being change agents, change is difficult, change is hard, but what does it mean to civically engage? It's more than just thinking about what civic engagement does for me, the skills that it builds in me, but how does it build and how does it impact, how does it affect the larger community?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Eric Vanover. I'm an associate professor of history at Germannic Community College and just all-around general education guy. I think it's on my business card now. I've also recently been serving as the interim dean of arts and sciences during a pandemic, which has also been fun for general education assessment and continuing that on. So in terms of background, I'm Virginian through and through. I was born in Wise County, Virginia, and the farther southwest portion of the state, but I've lived pretty much in every corner of the state and over the course of my career. I went to UVA at Wise, met some colleagues from there today, and then I went to Virginia Tech for my master's program. But when I finished that master's program in history, it was a little, I lacked some direction, to be perfectly honest, on what I wanted to do next. Research, teach, both, right? And I was lucky enough to be given the opportunity to go teach some summer courses at Tidewater Community College. And to be perfectly honest, my graduate studies in history focused on ideas of nationalism, of citizenship, particularly in the 19th century United States. So I had some background there. But my very first class is the reason I'm in this work now. I walked into the Chesapeake campus, if any of you all are familiar with Tidewater Community College, and I had a student body, a summer class, maybe 16, 17 students. Out of those students, only 2 of them were from Virginia, at a community college, right? Anybody have any idea why? Navy, right? Military. And I thought to myself, I've got to teach U.S. history to a group of students who have at least 9 to 10 different states represented here, who have very different backgrounds in their K through 12 ideas of history, from Texas to California, right? And from that moment on, I really haven't looked back when it came to civic engagement. I went on to get a PhD in community college leadership at ODU, focused on civic learning in general education, particularly at community colleges, but just in general. As far as words of wisdom, I do work at a community college, and we're very, very action-driven, so we want to kind of assess the situation and kind of build a plan, right? But I think one thing that we forget about civic engagement and the work of civic learning is that by its nature, it involves human emotions, right? It is an emotional experience, and you really can't separate that from the conversation. So when you prepare to do this work, to build a vision or to create a plan or an assessment strategy, you have to remember, as you engage with your stakeholders, whether they're local to the college or external, you're going to encounter those emotions, and those are going to be anything from passion to concern, anger, hope, inspiration. But really, you can get through those conversations in one piece. That's your roadmap, right? What is it in your local community or your greater community that people are passionate about? What emotions are coming out, and what can you do to address a problem that they recognize, or to follow an inspiration to solve a problem in the community? The reactions to this work and the conversations from it will run the gamut. If I personally work with a gentleman, Dr. Scott Ackerman, who runs our Center for Teaching and Learning, and he's done these community conversations where we brought in speakers that are open to the public. So we get a lot of opportunity to engage with different opinions and different ideas in a public forum, and a lot of practice to deal with that. But again, it's about passion. In some cases, it's about misinformation, I dare to say as well. But those emotions will run the gamut. So I think you need to be prepared for that, but I think you need to use that to take action, right? I think those are your resources for kind of understanding your community, your student body, your faculty, your staff, your stakeholders, your advisory boards, and just your general community. I always tell people, if we want to get a crash course in civic learning, just attend a local school board meeting. That will tell you all you need to know about politics and what's important in the community. But I do think the outcome of that, you will create a more invested, more connected, more aware, more empathetic community, because you've heard those emotions and you recognize those emotions and what people are passionate about. But then there's a next step to that, right? Then you want to take the time to build that inclusive vision of what civic learning or civic engagement is going to mean for your organization, right? You want to make sure that it's influenced by as many stakeholders as you can get to engage with you in developing that definition. And I think you need to stay true to the spirit of that vision as you do the work, but you've got to be ready to evolve and be flexible as priorities and attitudes and things shift in the community. So I think just to kind of summarize, be prepared to deal with human emotions and recognize and appreciate that. But then be prepared to build a vision out of that reflects the community that you serve, whether it's, again, a student body or a greater political community.
Thank you. Now, actually, David's quote from Frederick Douglass reminded me of something, not so much a piece of advice, but something I want you all just to be reminded of, and that is, the statement I made that the polarized society that we live in right now has seeped over into our college campuses. I think we need to remember as college and university leaders that when our students are coming to us from basically segregated communities, segregated by class, by race, and to some extent by political ideology. So we can't assume as we try to build our civically engaged, inclusive communities that students will have an experiential base from which to reach out to people who have differing ideas and perspectives than they do. So we need to do what we can to help them along. And that leads us to our second question for the panelists. So against this backdrop of polarization, what are one or two action items that you might suggest to those in attendance for helping to push against this?
Which order?
Why don't we start down at the end first?
Okay.
In reverse. Thank you, David.
Well, I came at this question from kind of an institutional perspective, and most of you here are in education in some form or fashion, and are probably, like many of us, civic engagement's a core requirement now, figuring out exactly what that's going to look like at your college or how to maximize the strengths that you already have in place. So for me, I think one of the best things you can do for your community to kind of set that standard to this question actually involves some education buzzwords, but if you've worked in higher education, you know those buzzwords aren't easy to actually achieve. So the first one is essentially make civic engagement a priority and make sure that the activities are intentional. Now, again, buzzwords, I know, but if you've worked in higher education, making something a priority, both with funding and with professional development, is not always easy to do. I recommend, and thankfully I have a president and a leadership cabinet that has allowed us to do that, but identified civic learning as part of our strategic plan. So not just in general education, not just in certain other priorities. It's one of our top 5 strategic goals. And if it's in the strategic plan, that's where the money and the professional development goes. So make it a priority. Be intentional, and this is something that I'm really passionate about, is you do this work in the classroom, you do this work outside of the classroom. Faculty, student services professionals do this work every day, but if you're not working together to make sure that there's some intentionality across those, or there's some follow-up, right, with students, you're kind of losing the big picture, right? So I think coordination between the curriculum, how you design this embedded assessment or civic learning in the curriculum, and the activities that you put on for your students should reflect some of those things. So faculty working with student professional student services professionals to really develop a calendar that reflects what they're learning in the classroom and the activities that they're doing outside of the classroom. Again, I think developing kind of a common language is really important. So for faculty and staff, we use the notion of a concept, a model, and a celebration, right? What's the concept? What's the model look like? And let's celebrate the successes of those when the faculty gather and talk about that. And for students, we do the introduce, reinforce, merge, and reflect. And the merge for us is making sure that what we do in the curriculum is merged with the co-curriculum, so students get that experience in kind of experiential learning that's outside of the classroom as well. And then finally for me, the reflection piece, and I'll advocate this till my last breath, but I know it's tough for us in assessment because we want that quantifiable data, right? But I firmly believe that meaningful self-reflection is the key to civic learning in higher education in terms of assessment. And it's by all parties, not just the students, but the faculty, the staff who put these things on, because if you've done this, a service learning project or something of that nature, you learn just as much as the students do, if not more, about the process, right? It's principal to this work, in my opinion. And my soapbox, I guess, for the meaningful self-reflection is that individual and group student experience really does matter. And it's really all right if you can't always quantify that. But tell those stories anyway, right? Find a way to get those stories of those student experiences to your stakeholders, to your public. And I'm still in that from Dr. Fizzler, who probably 9 or 10 years ago inspired me to go back to my campus and remind them that we need to tell our students' story, not just in the numbers, but in those individual and group experiences. So from a higher education standpoint, that would be my advice.
For me, and I'd love to build upon one of the things that Dr. Crutcher just mentioned, when you're talking about polarization in terms of varying political ideologies. We're polarized not just around ideology, we are polarized around individual people, and identities. It's gotten to the point where we used to be able to debate ideas. Now we attack people who have those ideas. And so when we think about how do we shift that paradigm, we have to look at civic engagement as that core competency, but it has to be beyond just rhetorical thoughts about civic engagement. It's not just an academic exercise sitting in a classroom. It's how are we practically applying it and how are we modeling it? And so we have to see civic engagement as a core competency. And if we do that, we can then begin to model civil discourse, because that's one thing. And again, coming out of the pandemic where people were separated from each other, I think we got to know each other on Zoom. I think the number one expression over the last 2 years was, am I on mute? And so we have to really learn how to engage with people again. And it's not necessarily innate. It's something that has to be modeled. We're talking about students, particularly 18 to 22, who need to have examples of how this is done. And so the first thing that I would say is let's create those opportunities to be able to model it. The second thing that we want to be able to do is really start to focus on literacy development. And when I talk about literacies, I'm talking about how can we really sort of inculcate civic and social literacy? How can we begin to talk about information literacy? We look at media literacy, and I'm blessed to work with some fantastic colleagues at Longwood University in the Comm Studies department, and they do a great job of really talking about media literacy and looking at how messages are constructed, and how are we interpreting those. So particularly when we're living in an age of social media, where people are consuming information, which, as we heard earlier, this afternoon, earlier this morning, it's not just misinformation, but it's disinformation. So how can we learn to evaluate more critically what it is that we are consuming? And so that goes into development of digital literacy, certainly cultural literacy. Again, when we think about cultural, not in the sense of the old E.D. Hirsch, cultural literacy, this is everything that an educated person should know, but cultural literacy in having a fundamental and foundational understanding of the various identities and cultures to which people belong. Understanding how, in ways people learn, valuing and not privileging one form of knowledge and learning over another. It's the development of that cultural literacy. And lastly is that critical literacy. We talk about critical thinking as being one of those higher order skills that we want to develop. But again, how do we teach our students to do that? What opportunities are we giving them to truly engage with it? And this is an opportunity when we talk about civic engagement is we take it outside of a classroom environment and we put it in the lab of the world. And so it's really thinking about how can we intentionally, connect our students with the stakeholders, with the people who are living, these issues, who are living these challenges, so we can begin to engage with, And then I think another, element, and you're really fortunate, again, I'm giving mad shout outs to Longwood today, but Dr. Pam Tracy in the Center for Faculty Enrichment during our Teaching and Learning Institute, we focused on discourse, we focused on, sort of democracy and civic engagement. And one of the pieces that we really focused on at the core was engaging in deliberative dialogue, okay, or deliberative democracy, whereby you have these facilitated discussions with small groups of diverse people, on a number of topics, that are of a vested interest to them. And it's not about, being right. It's not a debate. It's an open dialogue, because we want to hear multiple perspectives so that we can go, in the old notion of the dialectic, we can go from the thesis to the antithesis to a new synthesis. So it's that process of continuing to know and to learn. And then the last piece I would say, and a lot of us do this in our institutions, we engage in service learning, but how are we engaging in service learning? Is it deliberative? Is it intentional? As one of the facilitators in the previous session talked about, incorporating service learning into his classes, but he said that sometimes I create the syllabus before I've even spoken to, the community to find out what's going on. And so again, thinking about what is it that we want our students to experience, so how are we really looking at service learning, and how can we involve and engage the community more in the co-creation of it?
Sure. I think that I want to just applaud Chev for bringing us together for this day of dialogue and making civic engagement a core competency as a practical step towards achieving these goals. So while I was a William and Mary faculty member, I want to focus on student affairs and the roles that student affairs can have. So one of the important opportunities is to start introducing students both to the value and the skills of open discourse as they matriculate and arrive during first year orientation. And I was delighted to learn that Ronald Crutcher is being honored at the University of Richmond with a module for students as they come onto campus. There are, the task force reports includes recommendations about off-the-shelf modules at New York University, Open Mind, and elsewhere that are ready to be used in August to help to signal to students the importance of this as a value, and to start bringing these skills into first year orientation so they start to build them. And the second thing I want to say is we have a great opportunity coming up, which is the election. And that's going to be a tough moment for the country and and on individual campuses. But there are many ways to use that as an opportunity to boost civic learning. And I'm going to just mention the Institute for Democracy in Higher Education puts out this wonderful report, Elections Imperatives 2.0. It has 10 actionable recommendations. My favorite is number 7. Engage faculty in elections and policy issues, because the faculty are our experts. And one of the things we need to do is to bolster the appreciation of science, knowledge, and expertise in civic conversation. So a favorite way of mine is pick 5 issues amongst your student affairs staff that you think are really going to be important in the election, and then plan once a month from the beginning, or once a week from the end of September through October. Pick a few faculty members. So if an issue is immigration, a labor economist, a economic historian of American history, a policy person, bring them together for 45 minutes, a panel discussion about immigration. Then the students break out into groups, discuss it on their own, reconvene. Of course, you have free pizza. And we kind of bolster that notion of students being informed by expertise and then creating their own opinions.
We live in a polarized society nowadays? No. It's beyond what we can imagine. We can all describe our stories about polarization. The numbers are staggering. The way it's reflecting on our politics and government is staggering, and I have story after story that I can share. I won't because we're out of time. But Quentin earlier in the first session talked about how this is, our perfect union is not defined, right? I agree. And we need to let that open up to be defined. But we have a role in academia. We need to focus on getting better, right? We need to focus on making sure these students, these kids, at least know the basics, right? Folks, no two people in this room will debate that this is white today, right? We all agree this is a white pencil. We all agree this is a black cover. Facts are not agreed upon in our society. There is no such thing as alternative facts. There are facts, and we need to teach facts in our schools. We need to teach facts in our classes. And what we need to teach is acceptance of each other and realizing that the other side is not the enemy, right? The other side is simply, I never, ever, nor will I ever doubt the motives of somebody on the other side of the aisle, right? I might disagree vehemently with them, but I know that what they're trying to do is to get us better as a country. Focus on getting us better. Our kids don't know that. Our kids are coming out polarized out of our institutions, right? To all my liberal friends, you're not going to win the long term if you graduate a liberal kid. You're going to win the long term if you graduate a civic engaged kid that ends up to vote liberal. Right? I'm saying this as a long life Republican who ended up pounding the pavement for Terry McAuliffe in the last election. So we need to really educate the basics, teach the basics. And if we do that, and we teach them to talk to each other, those are actions that we can do. And that can be done at every school, that can be done every center, that can be done engineering and political science. Oh, by the way, this is not just a political science thing, right? This is not a schools of governments. This has to be a systemized thing. At George Mason, we're making this as part and parcel of the entire university. We just went through QEP accreditation and no findings, largely because of the strength of our commitment to community engagement and civic engagement. And that has to be our action items going forward as academicians, and especially in this great Commonwealth.
Thank you all. Before we go to questions, I'm going to make two comments. First, I just want to remind us that if you look back at President Harry Truman's Commission on Higher Education at the end of the 40s, I think it was 47, the year that I was born, 1947, one of the goals there was to fund GIs coming back from the war and open up higher education to lower income people. Why? To sustain our democracy. That was one of the core goals of that commission, and I think we've gotten away from that. Now, I want to applaud and thank Chev for joining on to the initiative called Civic Learning and Democracy Engagement. Carol Gary Schneider, who is one of the persons who roped me into being on the advisory council for them, along with Martha Cantor, could not be here today. But I'm hoping Chev will provide a link so you can learn more about that initiative. But I would be remiss if I too didn't thank Jody for doing such a great job. Where's Jody? Jody Fisher over there. She did a fantastic job, and this work is more needed now than ever before. So do we have some questions? Because we could go on talking, but we want to hear from you.
Thank you, Dr. Crutcher. We do have questions. The first one from the audience, well, from Slido says, who comes to mind as an example of someone who is modeling, as we've mentioned before, civil discourse in the contemporary public sphere that as a teacher or practitioner could point to as an example to our students? They did it to you, it wasn't my fault. Not my
I'm really so dismayed out there in the public field that I got nothing, not individuals.
I mean, I have one that I don't know that I would necessarily point to as a model, but whose book I enjoyed, and that was the former governor of Kasich, John Kasich. And if you haven't read his book, it was a really fascinating book. But Jackie?
I'll add, in terms of books, I think Ron Daniels' What Universities Owe Democracy is instructive on this. But I think that when I think of examples both on our campuses and our communities, libraries are really spaces where people, we have books from all disciplines, we have all kinds of viewpoints, and they're welcoming to all kinds of people in the community. So I think the role of, I hope there's some librarians in the room here today. And I think that they are a kind of archetype model.
I would add this. Jackie mentioned in her comments the Open Mind platform, openmind.com. And my wife, Dr. Betty Neal Crutcher, and I have used this for the freshmen in our mentoring groups. And what I would say is that it does a better job of helping young people understand why it's important to interact with and hear from and engage with a viewpoint of a variety of perspectives and viewpoints.
And I will say, in the replies online, someone mentioned StoryCorps. So I know this idea of going back to stories within your own community. These are everyday people, and that's one of the greatest models, not some large politician or entertainer. It's everyday people, so students can see how they can contribute to the community. So StoryCorps is a great place to find some of those modeling, as well as mention the Valentine Museum. So looking at our museums, our libraries, and so forth as well.
And actually, right now in Richmond, there's an initiative that StoryCorps is running. The Richmond Symphony just sent out a call for people to participate in that.
All right, next up. How do you ensure civil dialogue when you are working to have citizens of different perspectives in the room to discuss various topics related to civic engagement? And I think Dr. Page stepped on this a little bit when he talked about just civil dialogue and literacy, but anyone want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge when we enter into any kind of discussion is knowing first what our perspective is coming in, okay, and owning it and acknowledging it. Because there are three, what we always term as, there are three types of engagement. There's debate, where we know if I'm engaging in a debate, might is right. There's a side that's wrong. There's a side that's right. And so if I'm coming in with my viewpoint and my perspective, I'm going to do whatever it takes to make sure that you know that you're wrong and I'm right. Okay? The second is having a discussion. But here's the interesting thing about a discussion. I want you to think back in your lives every time you had a discussion with someone. And I think back to my father whenever he said to me, we need to have a discussion. What that meant was he got to use all his words and I didn't get to use any of mine. Okay? And the third is, how do we engage in true dialogue, which is truly that exchange where I'm going to allow someone else the space to share their thoughts and their ideas, as hard as it is to hear. As much as Dr. Ramadan said, as much as you may vehemently oppose it, the idea is I'm going to give this person the space because I respect their perspective. Doesn't mean that I agree with it. It doesn't mean accord. And so that's how we sort of get into that engagement. And when I'm talking with someone, I have to make sure that I'm listening to, not to respond, but I'm listening to understand. Because think about how often when we're engaged in that conversation, that dialogue with someone, and they've said something immediately that you disagree with, and immediately you turn off because you're calculating in your head, I'm waiting for that dead space. I'm waiting for them to take a breath so that I can jump right in and seize the moment. And again, rather than taking a moment, again, taking a breath, trying to acknowledge sort of what was said, and then respond by also reframing. It's like, hey, this is what I heard you say, and this is what, I think that means, to make sure that you have it correct, and then you present sort of a counter perspective, and then from there, again, do you ever think that you're going to walk away with closure, that you're ever going to walk away being changed individuals? No, but what you've done is you've expressed your perspective. I've understood you a little bit better, you've understood, hopefully, me a little bit better, and we can go forward. Because I love what you said, it's not about someone being wrong. Everyone believes that what they're doing is right. Again, it's rooted in our values. And so what happens when our values are in conflict with one another? Do we just go our separate ways and say we're going to agree to disagree, or do we find ways in which to work together? So I think those are really the hallmarks of how we do this. It's how do we set up the ground rules of how we're going to engage in this dialogue, and sometimes you have to say when things get a little bit too heated, you got to take a step back and say, okay, we need to put a pin in it, and we'll come back to it. But it's a process. We can never lose sight of that. It's an ongoing process that we get better at a little bit every day.
And part of the process is missing, and Jonathan, you alluded to this. Our students, people, don't know how to listen actively. I'm a musician. I'm a chamber musician. So you have to learn in a chamber group, you have to listen to everyone intensely while you're doing your own part. We have very few role models, certainly not amongst the talking heads on TVs. You can see in their eyes, nobody's listening. They're all thinking about their next. That's a big issue in regard to this topic.
So I have a quick follow-up. Jackie mentioned the election earlier. Yes, we have elections coming. Well, we have election every year in Virginia. We're a Commonwealth who loves elections. And I'm not going to ask everybody to raise their hand. I do hope that it is 100%. Everybody in this room are registered to vote. If you're not, or if you moved, but the punch line is coming in, all your students are not registered to vote, and they need to register to vote. In Virginia, you just go online and you do it. It's quick, it's easy, it's secure. They don't need to fill a piece of paper. They can do it online. Why do I know that? Because I wrote that law, all right? Everybody can register to vote in less than 3 minutes in Virginia, and they can do it online. And if we want to start civic engagement, we start by making sure that they engage in the system and they vote. I looked at some statistics in this last gubernatorial election. I'm sorry, our numbers on campuses and areas surrounding campuses are not indicative of a thriving democracy. More people in third world countries are voting on a higher rate than our college kids are voting and engaging in the system. So please make sure they vote. They can do it online. It's easy, it's quick, it's secure. I know.
So I think that. Oh,
Unless there are some final comments on
well,
that
no,
question,
I
this
think
will be
I
our
would
last one.
just add to that. I'm resisting the just innate urge to talk about the importance of liberal arts studies and discussions, which is, a historian in me, or even just a good core general education kind of a focus. But the reality is it's larger than that. And we put our general education plan into practice and brought it to the public for review, stakeholder advice. One of our board members came to me, actually called me up, and essentially said, this is great, and I'm looking forward to it, but what are you going to do for my workforce students, right? And from a moment from stepping away from general education and looking at that to a degree and thinking about students who come to us for a couple of hours of training or a class or a credential, thinking about that kind of opened my eyes to that what I think of civil discourse may not be necessarily what people in the workforce are facing. And essentially he told me this story about the fact that he was having so much trouble keeping, he owns an asphalt company, so much trouble keeping his employees kind of engaged with each other just during election year and things like that, that their communication with each other was breaking down. They were having arguments during lunch breaks and things over politics and other things because many of them didn't have that opportunity maybe in their K through 12 experience or other experiences to engage in that kind of conversation, right? And I think someone pointed out earlier, you kind of, particularly family, things like that, surround yourself with like-minded people, and maybe work or school is a place where you engage with people who have those different ideas. So I do think it's important to kind of think about this in the context of a skill. I was telling someone earlier, I think we need to start contracting out theater companies like to do professional development for faculty. Anybody that grad school for teaching or for your discipline, most of us didn't get necessarily a great run on how to teach. We got all the content knowledge we can handle, but when we got in the classroom, it was kind of trial by fire, right? And learning how to kind of manage that classroom and provide opportunities for the quiet student who you can tell has an idea and wants to share, creating those rules. We have a mantra that our English professor who helps with civic engagement, it's kind of like investigate the argument, don't attack the individual. And it's simple, but it works when you set that tone in a classroom. But take that to larger audiences, not just your history course or your English 111 course, but your weekend welding course as well, because it's not just an academic thing, right? The civil discourse matters, across the board. So.
I want to thank everyone. Thank you. And remind everyone to continue to communicate online because we can keep these conversations going virtually. So there's ways that you can reply to the questions that are there that unfortunately we weren't able to get to today, but also you can do comments and raise questions higher up. So please continue to use Slido. Thank you.
And I'd like to thank our panel so much. Now, as we're going off into the break, this is the last time we're all going to be together in one room because we adjourn at the end of the second discussion session. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank all of you for coming and for participating today. This has been a great day, and I know that the next session is also going to be terrific. So if you have a pre-printed name tag, there should be a letter on the back of your name tag, which tells you which room you should go into. If you registered after I printed the name tags and you have a handwritten name tag, you can just look it around and see which room is calling to you. But the same process is going to be happening in each of the rooms. If there is not a question on the tables, there will be shortly. So during the break, we're going to be putting questions on the tables so you can sit at a table that has the question that you would like to talk about. Please don't forget that there is a pay-as-you-go social after this at Pale Fire Brewing Company that the good folks at the Virginia Engaged Network are organizing for us. And so if you don't need to rush on back home right away, we do hope that you'll join us. It's a very short drive from where we are right now, Pale Fire Brewing Company. And let's see, am I forgetting anything else? Thank you so much to President Alger, Mike Davis, all of the staff at JMU for organizing this and doing all of the logistics and whatnot. This has been a terrific experience for me to plan. But again, thanks to all of you. There are snacks out in the foyer, and we will start again at 2 o'clock. I'm sorry, it doesn't really, well, oh, I'm sorry, which ones? This is A, that's B, that's C. All right, thanks.